Alright, time for an update and forecast on the park fire. I just did a live stream for about an hour and a half, but I thought I'd try to do a more concise one where I'd basically take all the information that we just learned and put it into a more concise format for anybody who doesn't have the time to go through another hour and a half live stream. So basically, the park fire has completely blown up once again. So this morning, and I'll be the first to admit, my forecast was completely wrong for what I thought was going to happen on this fire throughout the day today. Since the first week of the fire, that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it was very active. That was when it grew about 30 to 40 miles towards the north. And then since that cool down we had that Saturday, for about a week, we had very little activity on the park fire whatsoever. And then we had that hot, dry conditions this weekend with the chance for some thunderstorms, and there was almost no growth at all. So when I was looking at it this morning, I was thinking, you know what? I think this might actually be the last video that I do for the park fire because it hasn't grown in the last week and not seen any huge changes. But that was clearly wrong looking at the videos that were the live cameras that we've seen over the last few hours. It's been about as active as we've seen on the park fire since that first week when it was taking off. So clearly things have changed, and apologies for my bad forecast this morning, but again, I think the biggest mistake I made was just counting out wildfire in California at the peak of wildfire season. That was a mistake that I certainly will never make again. But I think now it could be a good learning experience to figure out why might it have blown up so much today when it hadn't in previous days. So perhaps that's a question that we're going to try to answer. First thing we should do is kind of get our bearings on where this fire is, where all that activity has been that we've just been looking at. So there's the fire perimeter. Chico's down to the south, Red Bluff to the west, Manson and Cohasset towards the north, Butte Meadows to the east, Paradise and Magalia down towards the southeast. Now, the first thing that I want to say is if you're in any of those communities that I just named, you're actually in a pretty good position right now. So here's where the heat was this morning. You see how little heat activity we had out there this morning? When I did my live stream, it was around 11. There was a little smoke coming off of it, but it didn't look like all that much. And then since then, that's how much heat it's showing now. Now that's going to over-exaggerate how far the fire has gone because it picks up on some of the heat that's in the smoke plume, but clearly much more activity than we have been seeing in previous days. Now the reason I was saying you're in a pretty good position if you're in Chico, Paradise, Red Bluff, Manton, is because this fire is mostly still only active on this northeastern side, and based on the winds, it's just pushing it towards the northeast. So not really near, it's actually pushing it away from Chico, away from Paradise. You have now all of this fuel that's been cleared out between the most active area of the fire and somewhere like Red Bluff. So in those communities, you guys can maybe still keep your alarm bells somewhat down. Manton and Shingletown, I'd say, is somewhere in between, where we are somewhat close to, or not close, but closer to where a lot of that heat activity has been recently. But when we look at fire history, we do have the Ponderosa fire between Manton and Shingletown and where we have a lot of that heat. And that's just also a pretty large distance. But a lot of those fuels have been cleared out, so that's a nice little protective barrier. So then the question would be, where are the concerns right now? And I would say it's these two clusters of structures that we see. You got Mineral right there, and I believe that one is Mill Creek. I couldn't really find the names for it on any maps that I was looking at, but I believe that's Mill Creek right there. And yeah, and just want to reiterate that just because that's where the heat signature is showing, it doesn't mean that's actually how far the fire has gone, although we certainly have seen it moving quickly throughout the day today. So why might that be? Well, the first kind of maybe answer to that question might be how blue the sky is. So something that was different this morning that I should have picked up on is that we didn't have smoke covering the fire. So what I did in my forecast, what I was thinking is, we haven't had much growth over the last couple of days. So conditions don't look that much different today. So we probably won't have that much growth today. because it's going to be like the other days. But part of what happened, I believe, is that because we hadn't had much growth over the last couple of days, we didn't have very much smoke over the fire this morning. So we had blue skies instead of that protective layer that we'd had much of last week that kept fire activity down. We had blue skies, which allowed a lot of that solar radiation to come in, heat us up, which dries us out, which makes the air right above the surface a lot less dense, which makes it rise up. It breaks through the inversion, and then you end up with those huge pyrocumulus clouds that we've been looking at right there. Then on top of that, we also have had a southwesterly wind. It's been difficult to figure out how strong the winds have actually been. The closest weather station that I could find was showing winds only around 13 miles per hour, which isn't very much. But we also don't have very many weather stations in this part of the fire that has been active. So what I think may have also happened is that the winds we did have were a bit stronger today than in previous days. Because we didn't have that smoke cover this morning, things started to heat up a lot more, and then it heats up differently in the valley bottom versus the canyon walls, so you can get stronger winds within your canyon. The way I always describe this is, it's like if you put your thumb over the end of the hose and then it starts funneling that water a lot faster. That's what your canyons can do to winds. The winds get funneled within those canyon walls a lot faster than they otherwise would be, and especially when you have a hot day where you end up with those larger temperature gradients within your valley and your canyon walls. So, I believe what happened here is we already had a spot fire, but then you get those southwesterly winds, especially within the canyon. All these fuels are quite dry when we look at the fire history. In this area, there hasn't been a fire in decades, so those fuels are quite abundant. They haven't burned out in a very long time. It's been very hot this year. We had that big heat wave at the beginning of July. And then on top of that, our weather today, we look at some of these stations. I'm recording this at 6 p.m. and that weather station is still showing 94 degrees. And their minimum relative humidity today was 15%. So it's very hot today, very dry. And then that shows just winds around 13 miles per hour. But when it's this dry, it also doesn't need to be as windy because your fuels are so dry that the fire doesn't need to use any of its energy to evaporate the moisture out of those fuels. It just is able to quickly combust. The other thing that happens when it's this dry is it can pick up burning embers like we've actually previously seen on the fire. Picks up burning embers, drops it into those dry fuels, creates a spot fire, and then you can almost get the fire leapfrogging a lot faster than it otherwise would. And you can even see that on this camera right here at the beginning. These are some of the spot fires that started, and then those can turn into their own little fires and usually end up kind of conglomerating, I believe that might be the right word, with the major blaze. But clearly this fire very active. This is a camera angle actually from mineral, and the last thing you ever want to see is smoke coming at your camera because that means the fire would be coming in your direction. So I believe mineral is maybe one of my top concerns right now, as well as this cluster of structures down there, which I believe is Mill Creek. Again, I haven't been able to actually find it on a map. But if we were to take the worst case scenario and do the distance from where we've seen some of that recent heat to mineral, it is still showing about 3.5 miles. Although one concerning part of the forecast is that right there. So this is your forecast for tonight in this column. Looks like temperatures staying in the 70s and relative humidity staying very dry. So that would allow the fire to remain active overnight. For example, when we look at the satellite imagery, you can see it is clearly active right now, and it doesn't actually look like it's letting up at all, even though we're getting into the evening hours. And part of the reason for that is because we're not having a good moisture recovery. Our moisture is not going up to 70-80%. Looks like we're staying fairly dry. So that allows the conditions to continue. For example, in previous days, when we look at heat activity, you would see this orange really die down overnight, but it should be able to stay a bit more active tonight. Now, the one thing working in our favor, though, is what's going to happen to the winds. So today, models did have it right that it was going to be winds from the south and southwest, and that is the direction that the fire has clearly been moving. You see that smoke going up towards the northeast. But as we look at the models overnight, thankfully, it shows those winds significantly calming down and actually turning to a more easterly direction. So that would actually try to push the fire back into itself a little bit. So I think that is the best news that we have to go off of, is that the winds are not only going to be calming down overnight, but they're also going to be slightly shifting direction, which will, in the best case scenario, take some of the smoke that we've produced today and allow it to settle down over the fire tonight, so then we aren't as hot and dry tomorrow as what the forecast is saying. Because unfortunately, the forecast is saying tomorrow we're still in the mid to high 90s, but even more importantly, it shows relative humidity dropping into the single digits, which is even drier than we were throughout the day today, which would allow a lot of that activity. Now, the one thing that could really help us is if some of that smoke settles down over the fire tonight when the winds calm down, and then we don't heat up as much during the day because we have that protective smoke barrier like we did a lot of days last week. Now, for that, we're just going to have to kind of wait and see. Big lesson that I learned today is that you never count out wildfire in California, and when conditions are like this, who is to say what is going to happen? But right now, certainly looks like we do still have a lot of heat on this fire. It doesn't really look like it's losing any steam at the moment. So if you are in those communities to the north of the fire, we have evacuation orders there, but I believe they've actually been extending some of the evacuation orders based on this new growth and this new activity that we've had. So definitely stay updated on those. Where we do have some good news is they have a ton of air attack on this right now. They have a lot of helicopters, it looks like, working the western side of where this finger is now extending up towards the northeast. And then they called in some air tankers, and it looks like those have been working the eastern side. Most likely not being able to do anything in front of the fire just because of all of the smoke that is being produced there right now. So, major change in fire activity on the Park Fire from what we have been seeing in previous days. So, this certainly will not be my last update on the Park Fire. I will continue to give you guys updates until this one goes out. I will never count out the Park Fire again, or I would say any wildfire in California, especially in the peak of fire season when you're in the triple digits and your relative humidity is as dry as it was today. Yeah, that's a good lesson learned, but I guess the only way to learn is to sometimes make mistakes. So again, apologies for that forecast this morning. Hopefully we'll do better in the future.